Hi, it's Cheryl for Bayer's Pampered Stampers. We are now going to look at my most favorite technique using the new Wow Dappled Effects embossing powders plus the polished gold or silver metallic powders. So cool. Look how cool this is. They call it double embossed. I actually call it triple embossed, because we've got 2 heat embossings with this, and we add to that an embossing with an embossing folder. Different kind of embossing folder. In my book, it still counts. So let's get started on this. We are going to use for this the Dappled Effects powders. I'm going to use the metallic gold. We'll use the Versamark, our brayer, an Altenew embossing folder. This is called Whimsical Bouquet. If you can see how gorgeous that is, I just love it. And I think that's it. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. I've got a little spray bottle of water because we're going to need that in a minute. So we're starting out first with a piece of plain white cardstock, the brayer and the Versamark. I'm going to go ahead and fill this brayer with the Versamark. You saw in another video when I was showing you how to do like a mirror card type background, that if you just smash the embossing pad on the cardstock, you get an uneven and uncertain result. And just for reference, here's what that looked like. This is just running the ink pad along the side. So you can see I didn't get full coverage here. I didn't get any coverage in a couple of areas. So using the brayer, making sure that it is full of the embossing ink, you'll get a much better result, and your powder will adhere on the entire card. So you're just brayering it on. I go back and reload with the ink, go over it again. You'll want to be generous with this. And I sort of start where I left off before, because I don't want to put all the ink on one side, so to speak. I'm going to lift this up and kind of look at it and see if I think I have good coverage. I'm a little bit concerned about an area here, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a little more ink, go over that area again. You can go both directions. Sometimes that gives you a better result. But when you're confident that your cardstock is fully covered, go ahead and set aside your Versamark. I set aside the piece of paper that I was working on along with the brayer, because this is full of Versamark and will attract that embossing powder, and I don't really want that. So I'm going to ombre these 3 colors on: the coral, the peach, and the pink. I'll start with the coral. As always, start with shaking it. Now I want to cover only about the bottom third with the coral powder. I don't have to have perfection in this, but I want to keep the powder there at the bottom as opposed to bringing it up any higher. I'm going to go ahead and clean up this powder. Try and get it into one of these coffee filters. And normally I work over the coffee filters because it's just a convenient way to attract and keep that powder wrangled. But I do put it right back in the jar. I don't mess around with embossing powders. If you can see, I've got another pile here I've got to pick up, or I'm going to have a mess and powders where I don't want them. So pardon me while I do my little cleanup here. So that's coral. I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to move back to this, and I'm going to go to my peach layer. Again, shake up my peach. Once again, I only want to cover about a third of the cardstock with the peach. It's my least favorite color, so this tends to be my narrow band, and that's just me. And it's okay that I messed up there, because it'll just go into the pink a little bit, and that'll be fine. I'm going to shake off the excess. and go ahead and return. Let's see, I can put this peach in here for right now and set that aside. And then last but by no means least, I'm going to go to my pink. And you can see I've sort of knocked off some of my coral at the bottom, so I'm going to have to deal with that in a minute. I forgot to shake it. Shame on me. So I'm going to go back and do that now. I'm not going to make things worse. And go ahead and spread that on the upper portion here. Shake off the excess. And I'm good to go. Let's get that pink out of the way, and then we're going to fix that coral really quickly. Now, maybe that I missed getting ink down there. That happens too. We'll find that out in just a moment here. So I'm going to pull back this coral, and I'm just going to kind of dip it in and see if I can pick up a little powder there at the bottom. And you can see I sort of covered over my boo-boo there. So this is ready to heat emboss. You can heat from the top or the bottom. It's not really going to matter. You can see I've knocked off some on the side here from the pink. My coverage, I would guess, with the Versamark wasn't as thick as I thought it should be, especially at those edges. The more you handle this stuff, the more you run the risk of knocking that powder off. So just be really, really careful with it. Here's my heat gun. And we're going to go ahead and heat emboss this. You are looking for shiny. Once it goes shiny, move on to another area. You don't want to dwell on this, or it's going to go back to being matte and ugly. But I hope it's showing on camera just how quickly that powder is melting. It's the heat of this tool. I don't recommend this for people who can't deal with the high heats. You have to be super, super careful with it, certainly not for kids. And you have to watch it very carefully because you want to make sure that it gets hot and melts on there, but doesn't go too far. So I think everything's melted, but one tiny little spot. And that's why I usually put my powders away before I start heat embossing, because you run a risk having the heat gun out around open powders. That's not a good practice. You can see I didn't have enough coverage with my ink here at the edges, so I need to be a little more careful when brayering on, but I actually made this a little bigger than what I needed, anticipating that that might happen, so I can trim those edges. So we need to make sure this gets really cool. You saw in another video with butterflies, I touched the butterfly too soon and some of the powder came off in my hand. I had that problem again down here with another thing that I heat embossed. I flipped it over and some of the melted powder came off. So you have to make sure this is not hot, that it has in fact cooled down. It should be very cool to the touch. Again, you're going to examine it carefully and make sure you don't have any spots that need to be addressed. This has a little spot in the corner that I'm not going to worry about because we're not really going to follow through in the embossing process here. I've already done that on a separate card. But what you're going to do next is take that piece. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to spray some water on the back. Get my card a little bit moist, and that will help it to emboss when I run it through my Big Shot. So I'm going to set it in my embossing folder. It's going to annoy me a lot because it's curly like this. But just sort of set it in, and you're going to look and see what part do I want showing on my card. Do I want it higher or lower, to the left or right? How do I want that to turn out? And then once you've got the parts that you want to emboss there, you're going to go ahead and run this through your Big Shot. And what you're going to end up with through the magic is this. When you pull it out of the folder, it is fully embossed like any other thing you run through an embossing folder. It's very, very cool. What you will find is that it's still kind of wet. So you have to wait and let it dry, or use your heat tool to dry it. Be very, very careful in doing that. I was using my heat tool to speed up the process, and I hit the front a little bit, and I thought, well, that's silly because I put the water on the back. So I flipped it over. And when I did this little bit of powder caught on my paper because it was still too hot on the front. So always be mindful of that. I went back and kind of fixed it. You don't see it too much, but don't do what I do. Do the right thing. Be careful with that. So that's where you should be at this point. We're going to bring back the sheet of paper that we've been using with the Versamark and our brayer. Now this time I'm going to fill the brayer with the Versamark, but I'm going to be very careful when I touch it to this because I want to glide across the top. I only want to put ink where I have raised surface because I want to end up with something like this where the highlights are in the metallic, not the whole card. So I'm going to go lightly over the top. Just like this. Make sure you've gotten all the edges. I'm going back to re-ink a little bit. I'm going to go over from this other side. Again, lightly and carefully. I really only want the embossed parts to have that Versamark. I'm going to set the Versamark, the paper, and the brayer aside, and I'm going to bring in my polished gold and a coffee filter, and I'm going to start adding the embossing powder carefully, and it should pick up only on those raised edges. As I do a major dump on that, I'm just going to get some of that powder back off there and continue on. I'm not sure if my brayering was thorough enough. If I was doing this normally, I would stop and I would examine it and try and see if I had the Versamark where I wanted it to be. Here, I think it's okay, but I'm just going to continue on till I've gotten all those parts with the gold powder. And it doesn't have to be perfect coverage here. We'll go ahead and tap the excess off. Set that aside. Now I've got some areas that I really like the look of. Look at this up here. Obviously that's where my brayer touched down and it shouldn't have. So I need to bring back in my makeup brush, which I have very carefully hidden on my work surface. Here it is. And this is just a soft makeup brush. We're trying to get a better glitter type brush. And I'm just going to take it and brush the powder off where I don't think it belongs. I don't mind if there's a little bit there, but I didn't want that whole bit there. You can actually take your finger if you don't feel like the brush is getting it. As long as you keep your fingers off where you do want the powder. So just gently brush that extra off where you don't want it, or use your fingers. I don't recommend fingers for everything, but sometimes it's the most effective tool that God gives us here. It's hard to get a brush in to do that. Here, it's a hard situation. I've got some excess there. I'm going to flip it over and try and tap some off, and that worked pretty well. So I've minimized what I had going on there. I'm going to go back and work in this area because I feel like there's still too much gold up there. But now that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to heat emboss this. Now this is our second heat emboss. We want to be a little careful. I'm just going to get this sheet of paper out of the way because it's got a little bit of excess powder on that I don't really want to melt. So we'll bring this back into view. Grab the heat gun, and this should emboss fairly quickly because it's a light layer. I'm keeping my gun moving because I don't want the layer beneath to start to melt. I just want that gold to melt and move on. Look how pretty that is. And it's still pretty hot, so we want to be careful with it. Again, you can see the stray powder, not too bothersome. I've got some on my silver example too. It is what it is. It's not a bad thing. It just adds to the beauty of it. I can see a couple of areas here that aren't quite set, so I'm going to go back in and hit it with a little more heat. There we go. It just takes a second more. You absolutely want to err on the side of underheating because you can always add more. You can't take it back when you've gone too far. But look at how cool that turns out. Whether you're a silver fan or a gold fan, both great examples. I can go ahead and trim this down, frame it on the cardstock, put a background on if I want. I'm kind of partial to the silver myself, but see what you like. There's so many possibilities. This is not unique to these powders that you've seen. Obviously, the effects from the polished metallics are unique to those powders. The dappled effects from the Dappled Effects powders are unique to those powders. But you could use any embossing powders that you have with any of the techniques that I've showed you here. And you can do some really cool stuff. So be sure and check out these new WOW embossing folders and have some fun. Step up your game a little. Thanks for watching. Bye.